The city of Bristol seemed to be holding its breath before something it couldn't yet name. From the moss-covered rooftops of the old Georgian houses, the winter wind crept through narrow cracks, carrying the salty dampness of the sea and the acrid scent of smoke, a faint, unspoken warning. The yellow streetlights flickered over rain-soaked pavements, reflecting the warped shadows of leafless trees, making the scene appear to move even though no one was passing by. In the quiet Clifton district, the winding slopes leading up the hill felt like frozen veins contracting in the cold, each curve swallowing even the faintest sound. Inside a small apartment, Joanna Yates sat by the window, the warm glow of her room standing in stark contrast to the darkness outside. She didn't realize that everything around her had shifted in some subtle, imperceptible way, as if an unseen pair of eyes was watching her every familiar movement. At the far end of the street, the last lamp flickered like a faltering heartbeat. A gust of wind swept past, carrying strange sounds, not footsteps, exactly, but a faint stirring that sent a chill down one's spine. The city itself seemed to be holding its breath, as though it, too, sensed that something was lurking in the dense night, waiting for a crack to slip through into the life of a young woman who had no idea this would be the night she would never again hear the wind outside that window. Outside, the fog still hung low, the yellow light smeared across the wet pavement. And you, when are you listening to this story? Are you happy right now? Beyond your window, is there still a faint trace of twilight? Or has darkness already swallowed the sky? Have you ever thought that a harmless invitation, a seemingly polite glance, could open the door to tragedy? Then, come with me, as we uncover tonight's story, a story that reminds us that sometimes evil is closer than we could ever imagine. Joanna, 25, was the image of a gentle and graceful young Englishwoman. Born in Hampshire, she carried with her the soft smile and unhurried rhythm of the countryside, where mornings began with mist and the tolling of church bells. After earning her degree in landscape architecture, she chose Bristol to begin her own chapter, a city lively enough to inspire, yet calm enough to nurture her dreams of greenery and open community spaces. She worked for a design firm where every day meant sketching fragments of nature, building visions of public gardens that could bring people together. Her life was peaceful and warm, steady work, close friends, and Greg Reardon, the man she loved, with whom she shared apartment 44 on Canninge Road. As Christmas approached, Bristol glowed beneath a canopy of festive lights. Old pubs stayed open late, and the scent of baked pies drifted through the narrow streets. Joanna had just finished decorating the Christmas tree, bought a few bottles of wine, and felt the quiet excitement of preparing for her first holiday with Greg in their new home. Everything seemed perfectly aligned: career, love, the gentle joys of youth. No one could have imagined that only hours later, that warmth would be torn apart. Somewhere in the stillness of Clifton, a sharp sound cut through the night, a brief scream, then silence. It might have seemed like an illusion, but for Joanna, it was the moment fate turned. The light in her small apartment began to fade, and in that instant, tranquil Bristol became the stage for a tragedy that England would never forget. December 17 began like any ordinary winter day in Bristol. Dull, cold, carrying the faint tang of frost in the air. Joanna arrived early at the Building Design Partnership office, clutching a cup of hot coffee and a roll of unfinished drawings. She worked diligently, refining landscape plans for a new project, her eyes lighting up whenever a colleague stopped by her desk to discuss ideas. She kept her kind smile throughout the day, occasionally flipping through her holiday checklist, little things that filled her with anticipation: mince pies, mulled cider, strings of lights for the tree in their new flat. Each detail shimmered with the quiet hope of a life that still believed in good days ahead. That afternoon, Joanna accepted an invitation from a few colleagues to unwind at the Bristol Ram pub on Park Street. The place was crowded, the bare brick walls glowing amber under the filament lights, filled with the mingling scents of beer and chatter, the occasional burst of laughter cutting through the hum. They talked about weekend plans, Joanna mentioned that Greg would be coming home soon, that they'd spend the evening decorating their little flat small but full of love, and cook a simple Christmas dinner together. The air was warm with laughter and easy joy, the kind of ordinary happiness people never think to treasure until it's gone. None of them could have imagined that these would be the last words they would ever share with their kind, bright colleague. Around 8 p.m., Joanna said goodbye and left the pub. The Bristol night was biting cold. She tightened her scarf, pulled her collar higher, and walked slowly past the bus stop, carrying 2 small bags, one holding a freshly baked pizza from Tesco Express, the other 2 bottles of cider. Earlier, CCTV footage from the Waitrose on Park Street had shown her browsing the aisles for a few minutes before leaving empty-handed. By 8:30, she called her close friend Rebecca to confirm their plans to meet over the holidays. Her voice on the phone was light and cheerful, untroubled by fatigue. 10 minutes later, the Tesco camera caught her paying for her pizza, her gentle face framed by brown hair swept to one side. At 8:45, she stepped out into the night, crossing the icy street toward Clifton, the familiar route that wound along the edge of a small park, where only the sound of wind and her footsteps echoed softly against the wet stone pavement. By the time Joanna neared No. 44 Canninge Road, the Bristol sky had turned completely dark. The windows along the row of old houses were mostly blacked out, save for a few faint glimmers from upper floors that reflected dimly through the thick fog. The house she lived in, a grand 19th-century building, divided into small flats, stood as quietly as it always did. Only one window still glowed faintly. The third-floor flat where Joanna lived, its soft golden light spilling onto the cold street below like a fragile breath of warmth in the heart of winter. She climbed the stairs, slipped her key into the lock, and the quiet click echoed down the empty corridor. The air smelled of old wood and faded paint, so familiar, so deceptively safe, that it would have been easy to believe nothing bad could ever happen there. At around 8:50 that night, a sudden scream shattered the stillness of Joanna's flat, sharp, piercing, cutting through the quiet like glass breaking in the dark. The sound tore through the brick walls, burst into the night air, and then, just as suddenly, was gone. Across the street, a family on their way to visit friends froze in place. The father turned, straining to listen, but heard nothing beyond the wind sweeping over the rooftops. A few windows flickered to life, curtains shifting slightly, then fell dark again. It lasted only seconds, but the silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with something unspoken. Down below, the street camera captured only a fleeting image. Joanna's silhouette passing the doorway, carrying her bags, and then disappearing from the frame. After that, nothing. In those few brief seconds, her life had already veered toward the unthinkable, toward darkness, despair, and an end that could never be undone. 2 days later, on the night of December 19, Joanna's boyfriend, Greg Reardon, was driving back to Bristol after visiting his family in Sheffield. He pushed through the long stretch of motorway, headlights slicing through the mist, his heart light with anticipation at the thought of seeing the woman he loved. When his car pulled up in front of the old house on Canninge Road, the clock was nearing 8 p.m. A faint glow came from the upper windows, the wind whistling through the tiles of the Victorian roof. Greg hurried through the entrance, climbing the narrow staircase with a small travel bag in hand, his chest swelling with warmth at the thought of coming home. But the moment Greg's hand touched the doorknob of the third-floor flat, the excitement drained from him. The door was ajar just slightly, as if someone had left in a hurry. He knocked softly, called her name, but there was no reply. Inside, the apartment was unnervingly still. Greg pushed the door open, his heartbeat quickening. The air was cold, the kind of chill that didn't belong indoors. Everything seemed in place. Joanna's coat hung neatly by the door. Her purse sat quietly on the table, the oven still dusted with crumbs from a meal unfinished. On the floor, their cat, Darcy, let out a faint meow, eyes gleaming in the dark, as if it had been waiting for her for 2 long days, hungry and restless. Greg moved through the flat, calling her name again, Only the wind murmured through the window, and the clock ticked steadily in the empty kitchen. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number once, twice, again and again. Each time, it rang a few beats before switching to voicemail. A deep unease began to take hold. Joanna never left without letting someone know. She hated the thought of worrying others. He searched every corner, each step heavier than the last. The room was full of her presence. Christmas cards lined on the table, a half-empty glass of cider, a wool scarf draped across the sofa. Everything frozen mid-moment, like life had simply stopped breathing. Greg moved through the apartment methodically, desperate for any sign, but there was nothing, no disturbance, no trace of where she might have gone. The stillness itself was the most frightening thing. Joanna would never have just walked out, not when she was so meticulous, so cautious about every detail. He called her name once more, louder this time, his voice echoing through the narrow flat, met only by Darcy's small cry. His hand trembled as he picked up her phone from the shelf. Her wallet, her keys, her coat, all there. She hadn't gone anywhere. She had simply vanished. By midnight, Greg was slipping into panic. He sat motionless on the couch, trying to recall if she had ever mentioned plans to go out that night, grasping for any explanation that might make sense of her absence. He replayed every recent conversation, searching for a clue that could prove she was simply out somewhere and would walk back through the door any moment now. But every theory crumbled against the reality in front of him, her phone, her wallet, her keys, all still there. When the clock struck 12, Greg finally picked up the phone and dialed 999. His voice was hoarse and trembling as he spoke. "My girlfriend is missing. She's been home alone since Friday evening. I've just come back, and she's gone. All her things are still here." The operator's tone was calm but firm, asking him to repeat details, noting everything down. Through the faint sound of typing on the other end, Greg felt his fear tightening like a noose. Every question only made it more real. Joanna was gone. By morning, the news had spread across Bristol. A young woman missing from Clifton just days before Christmas. Reporters were already circling. BBC, ITV, and local papers all carried the headline, "Young architect vanishes mysteriously before Christmas." Friends and colleagues were stunned into silence. Within hours, a Facebook page titled "Find Joe Yates" was created, urging the public to share her photo and any information. Pictures of Joanna smiling at her graduation, laughing while baking, walking with friends on sunny afternoons flooded social media feeds. Hundreds shared the posts, leaving messages of hope. "Joe, if you see this, please come home. Everyone's waiting for you." Across the city, missing posters began to bloom like quiet cries for help. Missing. Joanna Yates, age 25, was printed in bold black letters above her photograph, taped to bus stops, lampposts, and shop windows throughout Clifton. People paused as they passed, studying her face, the soft smile, the light in her eyes, and whispered silent wishes that she'd be found safe. Crime Stoppers announced a £10,000 reward for any information, and the Sun raised it to £50,000, an unprecedented sum for a single missing person case. Hundreds of tips poured in, though most led nowhere. Online, the city's collective heartbeat, quickened messages of prayer, threads of speculation, desperate hope woven through the noise. Volunteers joined Greg in the search, handing out leaflets and plastering posters across Bristol. "Joe's kind and full of life," one colleague told a reporter. "She wouldn't hurt anyone. If someone's holding her, please, just let her go home." On December 21, the first press conference unfolded under a heavy, suffocating air. Joanna's parents, David and Teresa, stood before a sea of cameras, surrounded by dozens of reporters. Their faces were pale and hollowed by sleepless nights. Every line seemed carved by dread. There was no anger in David's voice, only the trembling hands of a father clinging to a thread of hope that was fraying fast. Those who watched didn't need to be told. Everyone could feel it. Joanna was no longer just a missing woman. Something far darker hovered unspoken in the room. 3 more days passed. Bristol remained shrouded in cold fog and uneasy silence. The Avon and Somerset police widened their search, combing through the Clifton area, along the Avon River, across public parks, narrow alleys, and stretches of scrubland behind residential blocks. Dozens of volunteers with flashlights and leaflets bearing Joanna's face walked the streets, knocking on pub doors, speaking softly to passers-by. They called her name into the freezing air, but the city gave no answer. Joanna's phone stayed silent, her bank account untouched. It was as if she had been cut away from the world in an instant. By the night of December 22, police had formed a special investigation unit based at 44 Canning Road. Flashlights swept across the narrow hallways, glinting off gray, time-worn walls. The damp scent of old paint and timber filled the air as footsteps echoed faintly on the stone floor. Officers stopped at the door of the building's landlord, Christopher Jeffries, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone on the floor below Joanna's flat. The elderly man, with his shock of silver hair, opened the door, visibly startled to find investigators at his threshold. He invited them inside, his confusion plain. His apartment was crowded with books, and the dim yellow light cast long, uneasy shadows across the room. Police asked about Joanna, whether he'd seen her, heard anything unusual on the night she vanished. Jeffries hesitated, trying to recall, then slowly shook his head. He said he'd heard nothing, only the wind whistling through the gaps in his old windows. But within days, this quiet, eccentric man would find himself at the center of one of the most brutal media storms in British history. Mr. Jeffries, a retired literature teacher, lived alone in the flat below. His silver hair fell untidily over his forehead, his beard untrimmed, and his deep blue velvet jacket made him look like a man misplaced from the Victorian age. When invited to the sitting room for questioning, he appeared calm, yet visibly uneasy. He told officers that on the night of December 17, he hadn't heard any unusual sounds, only remembered that the light in Joanna's flat had stayed on unusually late. Still, his eccentric appearance, soft-spoken manner, and odd pauses as he spoke led investigators to quietly note his name for further attention. On the night of December 23, the police extended their search to the neighboring ground-floor apartment belonging to Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch architect living with his girlfriend, Tanja Morrison. Tabak cooperated fully, providing fingerprints, answering politely, even offering to make tea for the officers. He explained that on the night Joanna disappeared, he had stayed home working, and only went out late to pick up Tanja from her office. His story was clear, consistent, and nothing in the apartment seemed out of place. The team left, satisfied for the moment. Outside, Bristol remained eerily quiet as Christmas approached, while Joanna's family and hundreds of residents plastered more posters on walls and lampposts, praying for a miracle that never came. On the morning of December 25, as Christmas lights glowed across the city and church bells began to ring, a single phone call shattered the fragile stillness. In the outskirts of Fayland, just a few miles from Clifton, a couple walking their dog noticed something strange beneath a thin layer of snow along Longwood Lane. At first, they thought it was a discarded rubbish bag until the dog barked sharply and they saw a piece of denim and a patch of exposed skin. They froze, realizing the horror before them, and immediately called the police. Within minutes, the area was sealed off. Under the dim midday light of Christmas Day, the snow was stained with streaks of red. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that gnaws at the bone. Investigators moved carefully, their breath fogging as they lifted from the frozen ground the body of a young woman. The moment they saw the familiar brown hair and the pale knitted sweater, the hope that had barely survived in everyone's hearts collapsed entirely. It was Joanna Yates. When the family was informed, David and Teresa rushed to the scene. Greg followed close behind, his face drained of all color, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing for balance. When they reached the cordoned area and saw the body beneath a blanket against the white snow, David collapsed to his knees. His voice cracked as he screamed her name, "Joanna!" the sound breaking apart in the frozen silence. Teresa fell beside him, sobbing uncontrollably, while Greg stood motionless, hollow-eyed, as though the life had drained from him too. Across Bristol, a single realization swept through every heart. The girl they had searched for 8 long days had finally been found, but she would never smile again. The forensic report released after Christmas sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. Joanna Yates, the young woman everyone had hoped was simply abducted, had been brutally murdered. Her death was sudden, yet marked by unmistakable pain and struggle. The pathologist concluded that the cause of death was manual strangulation, an intimate, deliberate act that required sustained pressure and intent. There were nearly 40 bruises on her neck, deep imprints of fingers pressed down to the bone. The killer had held her there, gripping tighter and tighter, until her body gave up its final breath in less than 30 seconds, far too quick for another cry for help. There were no stab wounds, no gunshot injuries, no signs of sexual assault. She had fought fiercely, but bare hands could never overcome the strength of someone determined to kill. The freezing weather had preserved the body, locking some evidence in ice, yet that same snow also became a silent witness. It held the faint traces of footprints and minute fibers that forensic teams later extracted for DNA. Joanna was found fully clothed, her belongings intact. The pizza she'd bought remained untouched in the oven, the 2 bottles of cider still sealed on the counter. Only one thing was missing: a single pink sock, the kind she often wore around the flat. Its absence puzzled investigators, suggesting the killer had entered her apartment, attacked her there, and then staged the scene to mislead. Whoever it was knew the layout of the building, knew she was alone that night, and was calm enough to erase almost every trace of what he'd done. The investigation, launched under the codename Operation Braid, began immediately. Over 60 officers and forensic specialists were mobilized. Every second of CCTV footage around Clifton was reviewed, from the Tesco Express, where Joanna had bought her pizza, to Longwood Lane, where her body had been found. Among thousands of frames, one peculiar detail emerged: a gray car captured near the area on the night of December 17. When investigators enhanced the image, they saw the driver, a tall man with dark brown hair, forcefully closing the trunk before calmly walking into an Asda supermarket to buy beer and snacks, his expression disturbingly casual, as though nothing had happened. That eerie composure initially kept him from suspicion until the DNA analysis came back. Forensic teams had recovered stray fibers and biological traces that matched one man: Joanna's downstairs neighbor, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch architect. Lacking concrete evidence, police initially let him go. But, by the end of December, when his DNA was found to be a perfect match with samples taken from Joanna's neck, the picture began to sharpen into terrifying clarity. What followed was a storm. Bristol was consumed by a frenzy of media and rumor. Every headline screamed speculation. Every television anchor spoke with morbid certainty. On December 30, Tabak and his girlfriend left for the Netherlands for the holidays, a move that investigators interpreted as an attempt to flee. In the rush to act, police detained the landlord, Christopher Jeffries, the eccentric retired teacher who lived below Joanna, for questioning. That single decision detonated one of the worst media witch hunts in modern British history. Within hours, Jeffries' face was everywhere. His silver hair and hesitant expression were splashed across front pages, cropped and exaggerated beneath lurid headlines implying guilt. Words like odd, creepy, loner ran beside his image, turning an innocent man into the perfect villain for the nation's appetite for outrage. No evidence was needed. Difference alone was enough to condemn him. The public read, gossiped, and judged. In the span of a few days, justice was eclipsed by the press. An innocent man became the embodiment of evil simply because he looked the part. When the truth finally surfaced and Jeffries was released, fully exonerated of any suspicion, the damage was irreversible. His reputation, his dignity, his decades-long career as a teacher, All had been shredded by headlines. And though the world moved on, the stain of those days remained, a permanent reminder of how swiftly hysteria can destroy the life of a man who merely lived too close to tragedy. To restore justice for the man so cruelly wronged, the courts were finally forced to act. Two of Britain's biggest tabloids, the Daily Mirror and The Sun, were convicted of contempt of court for publishing misleading and prejudicial reports, while the investigation was still underway, violating the Contempt of Court Act, 1981. The Mirror was fined £50,000, and The Sun, £18,000. Later, 8 other national newspapers were compelled to pay Christopher Jeffries 6-figure settlements for defamation. Yet no amount of money could buy back the dignity that had been stolen from him. The Leveson Inquiry, the official report into press reform, would later describe Jeffries' ordeal as a serious injustice, condemning how the media had vilified an innocent man through prejudice, haste, and the insatiable hunger for sensation. In Bristol, people began to see evil in a different light. It no longer wore only the face of a murderer, but also hid behind the polished hands that held pens and cameras, when guided not by truth but by arrogance and speed. Meanwhile, detectives quietly flew to the Netherlands to question Vincent Tabak. When asked about the night of December 17, his story wavered and shifted. First, he claimed he'd been home all night. Then, he said he had locked himself out and climbed over his balcony. Later, he even slipped and admitted he might have stopped by Joanna's flat for a moment. The contradictions were noted instantly. On the 2nd of January 2011, Tabak returned to England, believing the storm had passed. But the results from the forensic lab were in his DNA matched perfectly with the samples recovered from Joanna's body. There was no longer any doubt. On January 20, Vincent Tabak was arrested, ending weeks of speculation and beginning a new, darker chapter of the case. When the trial opened in Bristol in the autumn of 2011, the courtroom fell into a tense, heavy silence. As the prosecution began to read the evidence, the true measure of the man sitting before the dock was revealed: a killer hidden behind calm eyes and impeccable manners. Vincent Tabak, neatly dressed, wearing glasses, his face expressionless, lowered his head as the prosecutor began to recount, in chilling detail, the final night of Joanna Yates's life. In his statement to police, Vincent Tabak claimed he had only wanted to be intimate, insisting that Joanna had smiled at him, which he misinterpreted. But when she screamed, he said, he panicked and strangled her. In truth, he wasn't trying to save her, he was trying to silence her, to cover the shame of rejection. What he called a momentary mistake was, in reality, 30 seconds of continuous, deliberate pressure, long enough for thought, long enough to choose. It was not instinct, it was intent. In other words, because of a polite smile, a simple, neighborly gesture, he allowed himself to imagine a connection that never existed. That's the delusion of entitlement that festers in certain minds, mistaking kindness for consent, warmth for invitation. Joanna did nothing wrong. She smiled the way any decent person would. But he, in that brief and twisted instant, turned kindness into an excuse for violence. That is why this case still haunts Britain to this day. It was more than a murder, it was a grim reminder that even human decency can become a weapon when seen through the warped lens of a mind that feels entitled to possess. What made it all the more chilling was what came next. After strangling Joanna Yates until her body went limp, Tabak did not panic. He methodically dragged her corpse out of the apartment, placed it in the boot of his Renault Megane, and covered it with a bicycle tarp, something he used almost daily. Then, calm and composed, he closed the door behind him as though leaving after a late night at work. Outside, Bristol was razor cold, the streets glistening with frost. As Joanna's body lay motionless under the tarp in the back of his car, Tabak drove to the Asda supermarket, parked casually, and walked inside. CCTV captured him under the fluorescent lights, buying beer, crisps, and a bag of road salt to scatter over the pavement later, to erase the tire marks from where he'd dumped her body. He wheeled his cart to the checkout, expression empty, eyes fixed, straight ahead, the face of a man who had just taken a life and felt nothing at all. As he left the supermarket that night, Vincent Tabak sent a text to his girlfriend, Tanja. "I miss you so much. Love you." Moments after extinguishing another human life, he still had the composure to pretend to be an ordinary man, longing for his partner's return. Then he continued driving through Bristol's empty streets, searching for a place to dispose of the body. Later investigations revealed that he had gone online that same night to look up maps of Longwood Lane, check the rubbish collection schedules in Clifton to find the most convenient time, and even research UK sentencing laws for murder, as if preparing for the worst-case scenario. Step by step, it became clear that this was not panic, but precision. His mind moved like an architect's methodical, analytical plotting, how to erase his crime, the way one would finalize a blueprint. The next morning, he went to work as if nothing had happened. He drank coffee, chatted with colleagues, offered opinions on projects. Just days later, when the entire city of Bristol was in turmoil over Joanna's disappearance, Tabak even sat in a company meeting, discussing how the firm could assist police in the search. The irony was unbearable. Colleagues later said they couldn't fathom how they had shared that room with a killer pretending to care. In court, when the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the CCTV stills, the DNA reports, the forensic results, it all pointed in one direction. Joanna had been strangled with brutal force, leaving 43 bruises on her neck and body, each one a mark of resistance, each a record of her final, desperate struggle. The courtroom watched in silence as footage of Joanna laughing in the Bristol Ram pub the night before was replayed. Her smile, her gentle face frozen now in time, cast a haunting contrast to the horror that followed. In the front row, her parents wept quietly, while the man who killed her sat motionless, eyes dry and unflinching. Then came the final blow. Investigators revealed that Tabak's computer contained hundreds of pornographic files, including violent sexual content and child exploitation material. The psychological portrait of the man was now undeniable, an educated, articulate architect on the surface, but beneath the veneer lay a hollow, distorted soul consumed by dominance, control, and the craving to possess. Every act that followed the killing, the concealment, the chilling calm, was simply the natural continuation of that darkness. On the 28th of October 2011, the trial in Bristol reached its end under a suffocating hush. After 2 weeks of testimony and hundreds of hours spent examining evidence, the jury retreated to deliberate one final time. Outside the courtroom, Joanna Yates's parents, friends, and colleagues sat motionless, their faces drawn, their hands clasped tightly in their laps. No one spoke. When the door finally opened and the judge entered, every gaze turned toward the bench. The verdict was delivered into a silence so thick it seemed to swallow the air. Vincent Tabak, guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years before parole could even be considered. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, sealing nearly a year of grief, disbelief, and dread into history. At that sound, Joanna's mother broke down. Her sobs pierced the quiet of the courtroom, raw and unrestrained, forcing many to lower their eyes. Her father sat behind her, his hands trembling as he gripped each other tightly, his gaze locked on the murderer now standing in handcuffs. There were no words for their pain, only the heavy stillness of two people whose world had been gutted. As Tabak was led away, David turned to his wife and took her hand. Justice had come, yes, but it was a justice that would never bring peace. Only the faint relief that the monster who had taken their daughter would never walk free again. For them, the rest of life would be measured in the absence of hers. The trial was over, yet its echo lingered across Britain. Joanna's story became a haunting reminder of how fragile trust can be, how even in seemingly safe lives, evil can live just a wall away. People spoke again of the painful mistake made when police had once arrested Christopher Jeffries, the innocent landlord whose eccentric looks made him an easy target. The nation was forced to confront its own haste, its prejudice, its appetite for outrage. Justice, in the end, prevailed. But the wounds left by that failure of fairness would not heal easily. Today, Bristol looks as peaceful as ever. The light still glowing over the steep hills, the mist still rolling in each winter night. Yet within the city's quiet memory, there remains the echo of one brief scream, swallowed by darkness, a reminder that evil does not always come from the shadows. Sometimes, it waits behind a polite smile, a neighbor's friendly wave, a familiar wall. So ask yourself, how well do you really know the person living next door? In the hush of those narrow streets, where fog curls around the lamps, and silence feels almost human, the city still remembers Joanna Yates, the gentle girl with kind eyes, who left this world to remind us all how heartbreakingly fragile happiness can be, and how one fleeting moment is enough to shatter it forever.